hotly contested election.
Well, Zach, you ruined the surprise. We were teasing it before the break of who it's going to be, and you just dropped the bomb there. It's Janet Yellen.
Steal your thunder.
I know, right? Well, regardless, now it's the cat's out of the bag. So it was Janet Yellen who was advising the Biden campaign in a briefing yesterday. Now, Yellen wasn't the only one in the room. It also included Harvard University professor Raj Chetty, University of Michigan professor Lisa Cook, in addition to another policy advisor to Biden, Jake Sullivan. There was also Heather Boushey and Jared Bernstein in that meeting as well, a number of high-profile economists. Now, this briefing, we don't exactly know what the details of it were, but obviously, given the hole that the United States finds itself in headed into this election, Biden trying to look for some help in terms of trying to engineer some sort of plan to put on his pedestal once the voters do end up going to the polls in November. So definitely something worth watching there. I want to note, however, that just because Yellen was briefing Biden and now Harris, it doesn't necessarily mean that she's part of the economic team that Biden has put together. That is the case for Heather Boushey, again, from the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, and Jared Bernstein from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Those two individuals are formal members of the Biden campaign, but Yellen, Chetty, Cook, were just kind of invited to the meeting. So a little bit too soon to be speculating over whether or not Yellen will join the team. And then obviously, secondly, if she would be considered maybe for a Fed position if Biden were to win the election. A lot of speculation, though, should be expected as we get a little bit closer to that November date, because as we know, people do love speculating about who these nominees might be under possible new administrations. Exactly.
Yeah, advising, you want to say that they're on the team, but advising roles, as you note, they're not necessarily official. It's worth noting, I think, that Yellen used to serve as the chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors under Clinton back in 97 to 99. So she has some tenure there under Democratic presidents. We'll see what happens on that front. Brian Chung, appreciate you bringing us that. Meantime, while we're chatting politics and money here, it might be worth taking another look here at the net worth of a new VP candidate here in Kamala Harris. Of course, Joe Biden recently naming her his running mate. And for more on how her wealth stacks up, we're going to bring on Yahoo Finance's Jessica Smith, who has the details. And Jess, combined with her husband's net worth, she's right up there with the Bidens.
Yeah, and one of our Yahoo Money reporters actually went through and wrote the story. She crunched the numbers, and this is what she came up with. She says that Kamala Harris and her husband, Doug Emhoff, have a net worth of $2.4 million to $5.6 million, according to financial disclosures from 2019. In 2018, the couple made $1.9 million, including more than $300,000 from her book, The Truths We Hold. She made much less when she was a San Francisco district attorney and the Attorney General of California. During those years, she made between $128,000 and $158,000, so much less. And then she started to get an income boost when she and her husband, another lawyer, got married in 2014. Then they started filing jointly. The couple does have 3 homes, one in DC, one in LA, and one in San Francisco. And Forbes says they have a total value of $5.8 million. So Harris and Biden, among the wealthiest of the candidates who were running for the Democratic nomination, other than, of course, you have Mike Bloomberg, Tom Steyer, billionaires. So they're in a whole nother category here. But yes, Harris and Biden were among the wealthiest in the group.
Yeah, very interesting. It's going to be tough, I think, for President Trump to attack the wealth front there as another billionaire himself. We'll see how it all shakes out. Jess Smith, appreciate you bringing us that. We're going to take another break here on the ticker. And when we return, how the streaming battle's continuing here in 2020 and why Disney continues to lean in on the success out of Hamilton, why it could prompt another musical coming to the platform. We'll discuss that right after the break. Stay with us. Welcome back to live coverage here on the ticker as we turn our fame and fortune segment here with a focus on the streaming space. And Disney, as we brought to you a couple weeks ago, had enjoyed quite the boost from the Lin-Manuel Miranda musical in Hamilton. And it's still getting watched, and it could prompt some more musicals to be coming to the platform. And joining us now for more on that is Yahoo Finance's Alexandra Canal. And Ali, I mean, I watched it. Pretty sure you watched it. Pretty sure most people watched it. How's it going for Disney Plus on that front?
Everyone watched it. And Disney Plus and Hamilton, they had a really sweet July. Before I get into that data, I want to talk about the overall average household viewing minutes last month, because according to 7Park, consumers spent about 662 minutes across a variety of streaming platforms. That is up 3 percentage points from the month of June, still down about 9% from those highs that we saw back in April when coronavirus lockdown orders first went into effect, but still pretty strong showing for July, especially since it's a hot summer month. And one of the main reasons it did so well was due to the release of Hamilton. Hamilton, of course, made its grand debut on Disney Plus on July 3rd, and it just continues to crush expectations. About 20% of Disney Plus users tuned in to watch the film. Zach, you're one of them. I was one of them. Everyone seemed to watch this film, and it did account for 7% of overall time spent across all 5 major platforms. In fact, the popularity of Hamilton even helped boost the engagement rate of Disney Plus by 20%, with users spending over 100 minutes daily on the platform. So some impressive numbers there. But if we take another look, titles, we'll see that the majority of them still come from Netflix. So I still think Netflix is the leader in this space, especially when it comes to content. But they do seem to be taking a page out of the playbook of Disney Plus when it comes to musicals, because the new musical that is based on Princess Diana's life will now head exclusively to Netflix before it even makes its Broadway debut. So this is a pretty unprecedented situation. This musical was supposed to debut on Broadway at the end of March. Obviously, that did not happen due to the coronavirus. Broadway has been shut down since mid-March. It will continue to remain shut down through the rest of 2020, possibly well into 2021. So this musical decided they were going to film the production. There will be no live audience. They have various health measures in place to make sure everyone remains safe. And then it's going to head to Netflix. So I think it's going to be a very interesting experiment to see if people still go out there and purchase these Broadway tickets, because certainly a Netflix subscription is way cheaper than a ticket to Broadway. But overall, across the entire theater industry, they are trying to offer more digital content to try and compete at a time when they're all shut down. Certainly the demand is there, especially since we've seen how well that Hamilton has done. So I think this might be the new wave of the future due to this pandemic.
No, I think it'll be interesting to see how it does, since we know Hamilton already had been, enjoying such a rush, so much buzz around it that people knew it by the time it came to Disney Plus. We'll see what happens with the with an actually new musical on Netflix. But outside of that, we talked last week about how I thought theaters were dead. It appears that AMC was listening, trying to launch a new exciting strategy to get people back into theaters here, making them historically cheap, at least for one day. What's the update on that front?
Oh yeah, they are banking on nostalgia when they reopen their doors on August 20th. And on August 20th, they will reopen about 1/6 of their circuit. So that's about 100 theaters nationwide. And to commemorate that, they will be offering tickets for just 15 cents a pop. That's an ode to the original ticket price when they first opened their doors back in 1920. So really cheap, really good deal there, only one night only. And then following August 20th, over those next couple weeks, they will reopen an additional 300 theaters leading up to the release of Christopher Nolan's Tenet on July 3rd. And leading up to that, they want to re-release some other classic films from the past, like Black Panther, Star Wars, because they want to try and get people back into the theater before releasing such a big blockbuster. Now, those films will go for $5 a ticket. There will also be reduced rates when it comes to food and different snacks. So AMC really trying anything and everything that they can to bring people back to the theater. But keep in mind that this is going to be a very different theatrical experience than what people are used to. There will be various social distancing measures in place. Capacity will be capped at 50%, and everyone will be required to wear a mask. Remember, AMC came under some heavy scrutiny after they said earlier this summer they would not require their patrons to wear a mask. They were met with swift backlash and quickly backtracked to those comments. So personally, I think it's going to take people a little bit more time to feel comfortable, but AMC have been pushing this reopening as early as June or mid-July. Now here we are over a month later. They're finally getting their wish, but we're going to have to see how things go next week, especially with all these coronavirus cases kind of seeing an uptick in certain states.
And I don't know how you're going to enforce a mask mandate in a dark theater. I mean, I don't know how that'll work. We'll see.
Yeah, there's a lot of the masks like under the nose. I feel like that was
the teens making out in the back row too. How are they going to do that with the masks on? A lot to consider here. But Allie Canal, appreciate you bringing us that. You're going to stick around because we've got another discussion coming up after this. In the hot election front here, as politicians use more music, we've already seen a few of them come out and sue to stop that. We'll chat with Billboard Industry Editorial Director Rob Levine after this on that front. Stay with us. Welcome back to live market coverage here on The Ticker. As we've been discussing, 2020 often is forgotten that it is a election year here, and we've seen the stresses around that ramp up. Quite notably, both candidates here use music during their campaign events, and among them, some artists out there have taken issue with that, including the Rolling Stones and Neil Young, who sued President Trump's campaign for using his songs at some of those events. And this year, when a lot of these events are shifting to online streams, the legal freedom to use those songs gets even trickier. And here to break that down for us is Billboard Industry Editorial Director Rob Levine, along with Yahoo Finance's Alexander Canal, back with us. And Rob, I mean, music's always a tricky issue. We in the media have to deal with it all the time, but it seems like artists are getting more irked when they see their music being used at political events. So how does it change now?
Well, one of the things you have to keep in mind, is it's actually songwriters, not artists. So when you have a live event, you get a license from ASCAP or BMI, and you can play, the tradition was you can play whatever song you want. If the artist gets annoyed, they write a letter saying you're in legal trouble, but you ignore it because you're really not. Over the past 10 years, ASCAP and BMI have had they've rolled out these special campaign licenses. So if you really don't want to have your song used in a political event, you can withdraw it from that license. That's why Neil Young is suing. That's why the Stones threatened to sue. when it's online, all hell breaks loose. You need permission from the songwriter. You need permission from the publisher. You need a license to sync it. You need a license to use the recording. It makes Obamacare look like Schoolhouse Rock. It's pretty complicated stuff.
And Rob, being in digital media, I fully understand the complexities and nuances surrounding fair use and online music licensing. But when we place that fair use argument in a political context, a political setting, political speech, how is that further complicated?
Oh, I would say, first of all, if you understand it, you're the one. They told me someone did. But I think the problem is that fair use is very context dependent. You either win a lawsuit or lose a lawsuit. And fair use depends on a lot of things. For example, how much of a work you use. Using 30 seconds, different from using a whole song. How are you using it? If you use it in a commercial, it's probably not fair use. If you use it in a campaign event, it's more likely to be fair use. If you're a news organization covering the campaign event, it's totally different. All these cases are very different. We know there have been cases where, political speech is more likely to be fair use, but we know there's been some cases that either settled or songwriters won. Jackson Browne with Running on Empty. David Byrne, I think, sued Charlie Crist. But there hasn't been anything on the presidential level in a hot campaign. Could that change things?
Well, yeah,
we're less likely to sue.
Well, we keep seeing, we've seen this before, maybe not suing per se, but we've seen copyright infringement cases filed
Sure.
here. The one in my mind comes back from Nickelback and President Trump tweeting that song, a photograph in a meme of Joe Biden that was taken down both on his account as well as the White House account on YouTube because of challenges over that use. But also we just saw him tweet a couple days ago, if not yesterday, Electric Avenue in a train, in a weird train video of him and Joe Biden's on the train tracks. Things are very strange, but he used the song. And so, when it comes to that, even that seems a little bit tricky in using all these things.
Well, I'm not a lawyer, and having talked to a lot of lawyers about this, they'll all give you different answers in different cases. But if you think about that video, right, it's hard to make the case that that's commenting on Electric Avenue as a song. It's pretty hard to make the case. I'm just a journalist, so I might be missing something. It's hard to make the case that that's making a political point. I'm not even sure. There's a fast train. There's a dude on a little, I don't know what to call that, a little train contraption. Is that political speech? It involves politics, but I'm hard pressed to tell you what the point is.
Yeah, and Rob, I guess because of the rise of apps like TikTok, Instagram, there are songs that are used in all of those clips. I know when I go on Instagram, there's an Instagram workout video that features music. Do you think since our lives have become so consumed with this online world that the rules surrounding fair use need to just entirely be rewritten at this point?
Well, I don't think that's likely to happen, because if you think about it, if you're a big technology companies have certainly made that case. Google has always made the case that the rules around fair use have to be rewritten. Ironically, when it's their intellectual property, the rules are really, really good just the way they are. I think that, big companies can license things. Instagram and Facebook have certain licenses. TikTok is negotiating for licenses. They just settled with the Association of Music Publishers. Like a lot of these there are certain things that are very hard to license. Certain things aren't. If you're a kid at home, I have some sympathy. If you're a presidential, if you can't work out a license to use Electric Avenue, my sense is always kind of a tough time running America.
Yeah, and that's always the issue here when we think about it. These are very tricky issues, but some people have fewer exceptions here to make to the rule. But Rob Levine, Billboard Industry Editorial Director, appreciate you joining us, as well as our own Ali Canal.
Thank you very much.
Thanks again. We'll be right back on the ticker right after this. Welcome back. We've been covering the fact that CureVac shares, the biotech company they're working on a coronavirus vaccine, has seen shares triple in its debut, but there are other big biotech companies signing some big deals of their own today with the UK government. And for more on that, we're joined by Yahoo Finance's Anjali Kamlani, who has the details. Anjali.
Thanks, Zach. Yep. So we are learning more and more about the distribution of vaccines and where we will see them hit first. Right now, we got some news out of the UK signing deals with both Johnson & Johnson for 30 million doses, as well as Novavax for 60 million, and looking to distribute that throughout the UK. Meanwhile, the European Union also making some deals with AstraZeneca for 400 million doses, and in talks with Johnson & Johnson for 200 million. Now, this is all really important because compared to the US, we see AstraZeneca with 300 million doses, Novavax with 100 million, and Johnson & Johnson with 100 million. And looking at news just out of the Trump administration, linking up with McKesson for distribution. And so we've been hearing a lot of concerns about how exactly these doses will be distributed, because while the governments are in fact making these deals to purchase the doses, it's yet to be determined how they will in fact be distributed. Meanwhile, eyes on CureVac, as you mentioned, IPO today, skyrocketing beyond $50 a share, but also to note that the German government did previously invest in this company, but did not in competitor BioNTech, which we know is working with Pfizer right now on a vaccine. So all very interesting how this is all shaping up. Back to you, Zach.
Yeah, no, very interesting indeed. And the company there, speculation squared. We think about a company that's not profitable, a net loss of more than $100 million last year, backed by Bill Gates. A lot of room to run, though, when we think about how much is at stake in the race to find a coronavirus vaccine. But Anjali Kamlani, appreciate that update there. We're going to take a break here. Much more on the ticker coming your way, as right now the Dow maintains its lead as the largest gains here to wrap up the week, up by about 0.25%. We'll be right back after this. Stay with us.
Welcome to Yahoo Finance. I'm Kristen Myers, and you are watching The Ticker. We've got a bit of a mixed bag today. NASDAQ in the red right now, and we have the S&P 500 in the green, up just under 5 points right now. But S&P 500 has retreated from some of those record highs. We were looking for a level of 3386.15 just yesterday. The S&P 500 was in spitting distance of that record high. Of course, right now it is at 3378. The Dow up about 0.25 percentage point, so the gainer of the day. Looking over at the Yahoo Finance heat map, we actually have bank stocks in the green right now. JP Morgan up over 0.5 percentage point. Bank of America up 1 percentage point right now. Apple down about 0.3 percentage point. We've got utilities right now in the red, looking over at XLU, down about 0.75 percentage point. And travel stocks right now are in the green. Looking here, airlines doing fairly well. Delta right now up 1.25 percentage point, but cruise lines are doing incredibly well today. We're seeing Norwegian up over 3%, Royal Caribbean up over 3.5%, and Carnival Cruise Lines up just about 3% right now. I want to look over at Tesla right now. That stock is actually up 1.5 percentage points right now. They actually received an upgrade from Bank of America. We're also seeing retail stocks rising on the news that retail sales rose in the month of July. Retail sales rose actually for the third straight month. They did miss estimates. It rose 1.2% versus 2.1% expected. Most categories did see gains, but weak auto sales did hold up those top line figures. And in stimulus news, those talks continue to remain stalled. Donald Trump actually tweeted out earlier today, quote, that he had directed Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin to get ready to send direct payments, $3,400 for a family of four, to all Americans. He then went on to say, in all caps, that Democrats are holding this up. Democrats have made concessions, slashing about a third of that roughly $3.5 trillion package that they wanted, but insisted on keeping assistance to states, cities, and other local municipalities. Now, the president has rejected both the top line number and said that he would only be directing about $150 billion in local assistance. And in the coronavirus news, case counts in the United States now just under 5.3 million. Now, new cases are on the decline by about 18% over the last 2 weeks. New deaths are also declining by 7% over that same time period. And while case counts are on the decline, we are seeing the decline also in those hotspot states of Florida and Georgia. But I want to continue here on those retail sales, because even though we have a pandemic, people are still continuing to buy things. Sales did, again, as I say, miss estimates, but have now risen 2.7% versus the same period of last year. So holding on to those year-over-year gains. So for more on this, we're joined now by Ted Oakley, Oxbow Advisors Managing Partner. Thanks so much for joining us, Ted. So those retail sales missing estimates, are you still looking at this report positively, though?
Well, it's what I thought it would be, Kristen. When you look at it, and I mentioned that, I think people were probably more optimistic in June because they've been told all along that, you know, when the summer months come out, maybe the COVID drops a bit because of heat, et cetera. And it really, it did to a certain extent, but I think it kept people in a series where they thought, oh, wow, maybe not. And so I'll decide not to spend as much money in July. And I really think that's what's happened here.
So obviously you're saying that people realizing that we're not coming out of this crisis quickly, which lowered those July figures. But if I were to ask you to pull out your crystal ball, what would you say is going to be happening for the month of August, especially because we saw that unemployment boost, that extra $600, that went away. Stimulus talks right now have stalled, don't seem to be going anywhere. Do you think people are going to be really tightening those purse strings this month?
It's a little hard to say, Kristen, because typically August surprises people a little bit anyway, because normally when you're going back to school, you pick up quite a bit in retail sales for that period. This year, though, a lot of schools are not opening. I have no idea how that's going to come in. I would expect that it wouldn't fall off a lot, but I would also be surprised if you had another month like June, because I think people, with what's happening now, and unfortunately for Congress going on recess, the people that might be buying some things, they're going to have to really tighten down. Even if it's for 2, 3, 4 weeks, they just don't have the money coming in now.
So let's look over at the markets. NASDAQ in the red right now, but they have been doing pretty well. Some folks saying disconnected from what we are seeing in terms of fundamentals. What do you think is going to be happening going forward, though? As I mentioned off the top of the show, stimulus talks have essentially gone nowhere in Congress. If we don't get a deal done next week or the week after that, the market seems to have priced in the reality that some sort of deal is definitely going to happen. But if we don't get one soon, what do you think how do you think the markets are going to be reacting?
Kristen, I think you're right on. I think the markets probably felt like that, hey, we're probably good till election time. We'll have enough money to keep things going for that sort of period of time. And now, with nobody there, the markets are probably going to have to relook at that. And the thing to remember too is the markets always change after Labor Day, and you really start to focus on the election because you get 2 months away and it gets very volatile. So that would not surprise me to see that factor in here.
How much of a risk do you think the election is going to be this year?
I didn't hear the first part, Kristen. I'm sorry.
I was saying, how much of a risk to the market do you think the election is going to be this year, especially now that we have Kamala Harris as Joe Biden's VP pick?
Well, personally, just personal opinion, I don't think it was a surprise to me anyway that Joe Biden picked Kamala Harris. And I'm not certain it was a surprise to anybody else. I think what would happen, though, is there's a lot of things up in the air about people thinking one party would win, the other party would win. I think the biggest situation you're going to get into is the markets are more expensive today than they were on the February 19th high, easily. So anything that throws it off at all, election or whatever, it can come quickly and you get into trouble in a hurry.
So I'm glad you mentioned that the markets are a bit overpriced right now. Do you think that we're in danger perhaps of a correction anytime soon? How big would that be?
Well, I haven't put this in writing, Kristen, but I would say this, okay, that for the first time really for us since February, I think where we could have a 10% or more anytime. It wouldn't surprise us to have that come really swift and sure in a whole short period of time. If you'll notice, the bonds have started back up. The rates have, they pushed quite a bit in the last 3 weeks, and the dollar's been falling, gold's been going up. You can tell it's in the air. There's a feeling of uneasiness right now.
And looking over at the S&P 500, as I mentioned, it had been, looking that record closing high right in the eye. It's retreated a little bit since then, but Goldman actually saying that we could see a level of 3,600. What do you make of that call? Do you see that much room for the S&P 500 to run right now?
Well, as a firm, Oxbow doesn't forecast, and I know the graveyards are really full of people that forecast because it's a tough trade to do. I mean, you have to put out something. It actually would surprise me to do the 3,600 number really from here, but it could. And I would say that for most people, they need to really set their portfolios based on what kind of risk they think they can take right here, regardless of whether we win higher or not.
All right, we'll have to leave that there. Ted Oakley, managing partner at Oxbow Advisors. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Kristen.
And on the coronavirus front, case counts in California top 600,000 as the CDC has projected roughly 189,000 coronavirus deaths by next month. September 5th was the date on that. So for more on this, we're joined now by Dr. Garth Walker, emergency physician at Northwestern Feinberg School of Medicine and Buehler Center of Health Economics and Policy. Doctor, we've been talking a lot about the case counts. They are on the decline. Wondering just off the top, why you don't think that we can get a handle on this crisis right now?
The reason why we can't get a handle on it, particularly right now, is we need complete buy-in from all stakeholders. And part of that is adhering to a universal mask mandate. If you look across states that do have high rates of using their mask as well as adhering to public health measures, they've been able to keep the rates pretty low down. And if we want to be able to be on the same page in terms of getting back to some form of normalcy, we have to be able to adhere to a lot of the measures that we have been advocating for recently to keep the transmission rates down. And in order for anybody to get back to their day-to-day business, they need some form of continuity. And part of that is people that may not be interested in putting on a mask, or other facets of our economy, as well as the United States, that are not able to do that or believe in it for whatever reason there is.
Well, doctor, you're not the only one that supports universal mask mandates. Dr. Fauci also said in a conversation, I can't believe I'm going to say this, but with Matthew McConaughey, the actor, I never thought I would mention Dr. Fauci talking with him, but he said that he also supports universal mask mandates. Dr. Fauci, not the actor. I'm not sure what he thinks about it. I know you're saying that should be the way to go. Why do you think we can't get some sort of universal mask mandate in the United States?
I think one of the challenges is that we have been politicizing public health. Leaders in public health have been advocating for this essentially from the start. We know that if we want to be able to achieve equity, if we want to be able to protect our most vulnerable, we need people that may be in privileged situations to be able to adhere to the mask mandate, or at least a high proportion of our society putting on their mask and practicing distance from other people. And I think the politicizing of it, not necessarily adhering to science-based measures, has been very challenging for us to get our message out.
So that number that I had mentioned in my introduction to you, 189,000 deaths, is what the CDC is projecting by September 5th. So about 3 weeks from now. That means over 20,000 people would have to die essentially in just under a month. How alarming is that? I heard that number and I thought that that seemed like a very large surge given where we are right now. Actually, I'm just looking at the death count right now. It's 167,528 in the United States. So that seems like a very large leap. Is that just par for the course in what we're seeing? Or when you hear a number like that, are you also alarmed that we're going to be seeing some sort of very large spike coming in the next couple of weeks?
Thanks, Kristen. I am alarmed, particularly because this is considered avoidable, right? We can put forth measures to help offset these projections. If we know that our current trend is 20,000 deaths from now, we need to get everyone online in terms of putting on a mask, practicing 6 feet distance, and making sure that we are doing our part to protect our family, our friends, our communities, people within our economy that are struggling to get their jobs going and want to get to some form of stability to some degree later. So it's more than just deaths, but at baseline, we should have enough empathy to be able to ensure that we are adhering to these measures and thinking about how we can help save each other's lives.
So the CDC also said that this fall could be the worst fall for public health. Schools are going to be reopening soon. Do you agree with that estimation that this could be the worst fall for public health? And how much do you think these school reopenings are going to play in that?
I am concerned. I'm concerned with flu season, which we have a ton of data when it starts, what happens when people take vaccines, but also the collision course of COVID. At minimum, hospital systems need to be well equipped and well aware of potential surges. So ensuring that our hospital systems are able to bear that surge with competing viruses that could be putting multiple vulnerable populations at risk, it becomes very scary. With the schools, it can be a double-edged sword. It's one of those situations where there's pros and cons, particularly if we're talking about schools that have very high dense areas, such as public schools, schools in underserved populations that may not be able to have the appropriate ratios or the space to safely protect against transmission. But at the same time, a lot of those communities are residing, people of color and vulnerable communities are residing in regions where they rely on school for lunch, or they rely on school for childcare. So it can be very challenging, but at minimum, we need to be very intentional about how we are thinking about both communities, our most vulnerable communities, as well as our most privileged communities, in the event that they go to school as well as stay home.
All right, we'll have to leave that there. Dr. Garth Walker, emergency physician at Northwestern Feinberg School of Medicine. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And after the break, we'll dive further into the war between the president and the U.S. Postal Service. That's next. Welcome back to Yahoo Finance. Checking market action right now. The Nasdaq remains in the red. The Dow, the leader of the day, up about 1/4 percentage point. S&P 500 fairly flat right now, up just over 2 points. Level on the S&P 500 right now, just over 3375. Watching those levels there, as the S&P 500 has retreated quite a bit from the record closing high level of 3385, over 3385. Well, the war against the post office has heated up today after former President Barack Obama said that President Trump was attempting to, quote, starve the post office. So for more on the latest moves in this battle involving USPS, we are joined by Yahoo Finance's Rick Newman. Hey, Rick.
Hey.
So give us the latest details. Honestly, I rarely use the post office, so it is fascinating, really, that the post office has become a part of this political tug of war between the president and the Democrats right now.
Well, I will point out anybody who gets packages from Amazon or any other delivery service probably does get deliveries from the Postal Service. You don't always know where it comes from. That's one of the things that ticks off President Trump. But he really started a bit of a bonfire, maybe you could call it a dumpster fire yesterday, when he said in that interview on Fox Business that he opposes additional funding for the Postal Service that is in the Democrats' version of the latest stimulus bill, because he basically thinks it would expand voting. So he's all but acknowledged that he does not want people to vote by mail because he thinks more people will therefore vote, and that this would be bad for Republicans. Now, he keeps saying there's more fraud through mail-in voting. There's no evidence of that. And there's also no evidence that it gives Democrats an advantage over Republicans. In fact, there are some what you would call red states like Utah, for example, Montana, also controlled by Republicans, that have mail-in voting. Most people in those states vote by mail. So Trump is just convinced this is going to be a problem. So he's standing in the way of this additional funding. The Postal Service is kind of a basket case. It always loses money, and there's definitely some long-term structural problems with the Postal Service. But that's not what this is about right now. This is about, will the Postal Service be able to deliver mail-in ballots, assuming there is a big surge of mail-in voting in November.
So I want to know if you think that the president actually will shell out some money, because we got some news that he said today that he would agree to up to $25 billion in funding. He said, quote, sure, if they give us what we want, referring to the Democrats. Do you think that's going to help stimulus negotiations at all?
I think the Democrats at this point cannot possibly back down on their demand for more funding for the Postal Service. And the Democrats are actually after two things. We should just point out the difference. So they want that $25 billion. That's just for basic operational funding, not necessarily related to delivering mail-in ballots, but just to plug the holes, basically. But then they also want another $3.6 billion that would go to states to help with mail-in balloting. So help, buy drop boxes, for example, if that's what states need, or what it pay for the postage of all this extra mailing of ballots and things like that. Now that Trump has made this such a public issue, I think there's absolutely no way Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer in Congress and other Democrats, I don't think there's any way they can back down from this, because Trump has now said what he's after. They have a pretty good cause. I mean, in general, even if people don't use the mail, Kristen, people like the fact that the mail comes reliably. They expect it to come reliably. So I think Trump has picked a fight here in a way that's going to be very hard for him to win.
And New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy, he is a Democrat, I want to point out for everyone, says that they're now going to be adopting mail-in voting. I feel like a lot of states are making this move where they say they want to adopt mail-in voting, even though it is going to be costly. I know Democrats want upwards of $4 billion to assist in this measure. And I know that they're scrambling to try to get it done. Do you think even more states in the run-up to the election are going to say, hey, we're definitely going to be adopting this?
Yeah, for sure. But this is not an all or nothing thing. It's not that if you decide to expand mail-in voting, then people will only be able to vote by mail. I mean, what New Jersey has said, the governor there said that what they have decided to do is mail every voter a ballot. So if you're registered, you will get a ballot in the mail. And then there are a variety of things you can do. You could mail it back, or you could drop it off at one of these drop boxes, or you could take it to a polling place on election day. I think, a lot of states are expanding mail-in voting in different ways, such as this. But basically what they're trying to do is give people an option for how they want to return their ballot. And at the same time, operate fewer polling places where people go in person, and also, have fewer polling workers there in person, obviously to limit exposure to the coronavirus.
All right. Well, we'll have to see how the Postal Service continues to be a pawn in this game, or this war, should I say, between the Dems and the president. Thanks so much, Rick.
See ya.
And after the break, Fortnite sues Apple and Google after being banned. That's next. Welcome back to live market coverage here on Yahoo Finance. Checking market action right now. We are seeing the NASDAQ remain in the red as tech stocks are dragging there. Apple down over 0.5 percentage point right now. Facebook down about 0.09 percentage points. We are continuing to see bank stocks in the green right now. Bank of America up over 0.5 percentage point. JP Morgan is also in the green, up about 0.5 percentage point. Well, there is a new movement, hashtag free Fortnite, after the game was banned from both the Google and Apple app stores. And Fortnite decided to troll Apple in this spoof of its iconic 1984 commercial. Take a look.
In exchange, we have taken our tribute, our profits, our control. This power is ours and ours alone. We shall prevail.
So for more on this lawsuit, we're joined now by Yahoo Finance's Alexis Keenan. Hey, Alexis.
Hey, Kristen. So, yes, well timed, I guess I'll say, for this lawsuit, certainly taking public sentiment into account. Also interesting to note that 40% of Epic, which owns Fortnite, is owned by the Chinese behemoth Tencent, also owner of WeChat, which of course is the subject of the executive order, at least one of them, banning American companies from transacting with WeChat. The terms of that still unclear. But let's talk about this lawsuit a little bit. So Epic Games bringing this against both Apple and Google, saying that they are not pleased that both companies have decided to kick out the mobile version of the Fortnite game out of their app stores. They're booted, of course, because Epic launched its own way for players to make a direct purchase. Their in-game purchases is what they're called. And what that does is it sidesteps the 30% charge, the fee that Google and Apple assess for these types of in-game purchases. And that is a violation of their terms of service. So what does Epic want? They want an injunction, this lawsuit or these lawsuits say. They want that app put back into the app stores. And just to give you an idea of the amount of money that this game generates, just from March 2018 until the present, it generated $360 million for Apple in revenues. And these claims, though, they're based on antitrust laws. So what the company is saying is that the fees in the Google and app stores, they amount to what is an illegal monopoly. But whether they're winning claims, not necessarily a slam dunk here. Epic is going to have to prove that the app store fees, these restraints are what they're called in antitrust law, they're going to have to show that it harms consumers, not just Epic. And also they're going to have to show that there's harm to competition and not just lost revenues for the company. So a lot to think about here, but certainly this is a well-timed lawsuit by this company.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially considering that tech companies are actually under congressional scrutiny right now over some of those very same issues, Apple especially in particular in reference to its app store. So unclear, perhaps Fortnite might get a boost in their lawsuit from some of those claims. Thanks so much, Alexis.
You're welcome.
And we're going to take a quick break. And after this, we're going to be talking about the gap in PPP funding received by Black female business owners. That's next. Welcome back to live market coverage here on Yahoo Finance. Checking market action right now. Still a mixed bag. Nasdaq remains in the red today. The Dow, the leader of the day, up over a 1/10 of a percentage point. S&P 500 right now fairly flat, up over just 2 points. Well, PPP loans were supposed to be helping businesses most in need, but according to the government watchdog Accountable, Black women business owners were largely left out from receiving PPP funds. So to discuss this, we are joined now by Jenna Cruz, Accountable U.S. Director of Rapid Response Research and Communications. Thanks so much for joining us, Jenna. So according to the research from Accountable, less than 0.5%, I want to say that again, 0.5% for people that might have missed that, of those PPP loans went to businesses owned by Black women, while in the meantime, 70% of those loans went to white men. Can you explain that gap, which is astronomical in size?
I wish I could explain that gap. Unfortunately, with the data that the Small Business Administration released on the PPP program, there is very limited data sets, but what we were able to find was that Black women were, especially Black women, were left out of access to these vital loans, loans that are intended to help payroll in order to keep businesses afloat during this global pandemic. And it wasn't just a 0.5% of women or Black women that had these that had access to these loans. It was also in the upper loan range of the 5 to 10 million PPP loans. There was just one Black woman-owned business that was able to get that upper tranche versus over 300 businesses owned by white men.
So I'm glad that you mentioned that loan size. Wondering, however, if the size might be down to the fact that Black-owned businesses tend to be smaller, or is there something else that we're missing there, that they just weren't receiving the funds that they needed?
Well, it shouldn't be so much about what the size of the businesses or the number of businesses. What it should be about is understanding that Black women and the Black community have been facing undue burdens during this coronavirus pandemic, and certainly have had felt greater ramifications in terms of health and also in terms of economic concerns. And so to just have one business to have received more than 5 million, I'm sure I could find a couple more for the federal government in order to get access to that $5 million loan amount.
So I want to get to that disproportionate impact in just a moment. I'm wondering if you think that there's an access gap that might be tied into this. We talk about this a lot, for example, when we talk about entrepreneurs of color that are always excluded from receiving funds because they, lack the networks, lack the ability to pitch, or not given the tools rather to do successful pitches. So is there some sort of access gap that might be tied into this? Perhaps lack of knowledge of some of these loans and the funds that might be available to them, lack of, employees that might be working strictly to secure those funds in the same way that some of those larger companies have access to?
Well, other independent of our analysis, there are reports that Black business owners have had difficulty in gaining access to PPP loans, particularly, and a lot of that has been on the loan terms set out by the government and the incentives provided to banks in order to basically circumvent communities that don't typically have access or don't typically bank with those pre-established lenders.
So what you're saying then is that from the start, Black businesses were being left out just based on the terms and conditions that they would have had to meet in order to essentially even receive these funds.
Absolutely. There were missteps all along the way in creating the Paycheck Protection Program, basically from its design and most certainly during its implementation.
Do you worry, we don't yet have a new stimulus act, but do you worry that these mistakes are going to be repeated again once we do get a new stimulus deal done?
Well, I think certainly in any new stimulus deal that is agreed upon, the important part to all of it should be greater oversight and greater ability for we at Accountable and other government watchdog organizations to tap into the data and to see who is receiving loans, how much those loans are for, where those loans are going, basically all the demographic data, anything that would help us to better provide insight into some of the communities that may be being overlooked.
So to that point, circling back to what you had mentioned earlier, as we know, Black communities have been disproportionately impacted by the coronavirus. When it comes to businesses, we are seeing some businesses shutting left, right, and center. I'm wondering if you can explain to us what you think the impact is going to be going forward from the fact that, as you mentioned, only one business received a loan of over $5 million, only 35 businesses received a loan over $1 million. So what is the impact going to be, do you think, on the Black community going forward, particularly those Black business owners? And do you see this as only widening that gap even further between white and Black communities?
I do think that once this pandemic is over, God hopes, there is going to be some pretty scary, horrific numbers in terms of the Black communities' businesses that they own, in terms of in compared to other demographic areas. Right now, there are reports that even say that 40% of Black-owned businesses have already closed because of the pandemic.
All right, well, we'll have to leave that conversation there. Jenna Cruz, Accountable.us, Director of Rapid Response Research and Communications. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Kristen.
And on the other side of the break, we'll be chatting calls to defund the police and who opposes those calls. You might be surprised. That's next. Welcome back to Yahoo Finance. Checking market action right now. The S&P 500 has joined the Nasdaq in the red. So the Dow right now, the only major index in the green, up over just a 1/10 of a percentage point there. The S&P 500, though, in the red, is fairly flat, only down about 1/2 point right now. The Nasdaq down about 1/4 of a percentage point. We are seeing utilities in the red right now. XLU, Spider Fund, down about 3/4 of a percentage point. Tesla, again, they had gotten an upgrade earlier today. They are up about 1.5 percentage points right now. Well, the calls to defund the police have been loud in the last few months, as some police departments in the country have actually seen their budgets slashed. But here in New York, Black City Council members are opposing the measure, which might come as a surprise to some. So to chat about why, we are joined now by Alika Ampry-Samuel, New York City Council member representing District 41, which is right here in Brooklyn. So Councilwoman, I think most people believe that Black communities would embrace this initiative of defunding the police, especially given the over-policing that we know happens in minority communities. You are not embracing this initiative. Why?
I'll first say, just to correct the record, I do embrace defunding NYPD. But my question is always, what does that look like? And what impact does it have on certain communities? Because every single community is totally different. And I say that because, how do you tell a senior woman who lives alone in my district in a building that doesn't have a security guard or concierge, that live in a community with a high crime rate? How do you tell them there will be no police? What do you say to that particular woman? And so in certain parts of my community, that's, welcomed, where, families and individuals don't have to worry about certain levels of safety because of where they live. But in other certain areas, in particular, where my concentration of public housing is located, it's a different conversation there. And so for me, defund NYPD has always been the call, has always been the priority. But the question in New York City is how.
So I'm actually glad you mentioned some of that. I decided to check out poverty and crime stats, at least for Kings County, so that's Brooklyn. 20% of the people here in this county live in poverty. The biggest increases in murders inside the city are actually right here in Brooklyn. So to that end, if defunding the police, unlikely to happen with the NYPD, but if some sort of initiative like that were to be going forward, at least to the extent that we've seen in some other police departments, what do you think would happen to that crime rate, at least in Brooklyn or in some of the districts or some of the areas rather that you represent?
So for me, I've been talking about defunding NYPD and funding more community-based organizations that work directly with public safety, like the crisis management system. And Cure Violence comes out of the crisis management. That's just one of the types of programs, and conflict mediation. And I'll just give you a quick example. During the budget negotiations, I was the one who questioned how much funding, how much money was paid out in overtime for the gang violence unit, and was told that it was close to $1 million. And I came back and said, well, if that was $1 million in Brooklyn North, how about we take that same $1 million and not have the gang violence unit operating and put that $1 million in our Cure Violence organization? What would crime look like then? And so I think the answer to a lot of gang violence and crime and increase in violence that we're seeing is really based on the fact that our organizations are not funded at the levels that they should be funded to stop what we're seeing.
So to that point, Councilwoman, the New York Police Department actually has, at least when it comes to per resident here, some of the highest numbers per resident. Each resident pays the most in New York City for the police department, the most actually, I believe, in the country compared to some other cities and municipalities. Wondering if some of those numbers, to your point, need to come down and create a blend here where we perhaps are taking some money out of that NYPD budget and instead funding initiatives that are going to tackle issues like poverty inside the city, like homelessness inside the city, like mental health inside the city, those initiatives instead of funneling it all into the criminal justice system.
That's a no-brainer, right? We've been talking about this not just over the past 4 months. We've been talking about this for years. And, and as much as I fight City Hall and been fighting for, years now of getting more funding for our, like I said, community-based organizations and, social workers in our schools, counselors in our schools to deal with trauma, and talk about schools. How about we get air conditioning in the schools to help children be able to learn and focus so that they are not leaving because the school is too dang on high. There's so many things that we can do in better ways to allocate city dollars. And so it really falls to, for me, leadership. If we had an executive administrator who cared enough to fund organizations and agencies the way they should and not be afraid of the NYPD, I think that we would be in a different place. And that just goes back to organizing. We can talk about the strength in the unions within the NYPD and everyone fearing, the union bosses. I think that if we, begin to really look at the strength that we have in our community and the power that we have, we'll be able to demand more funding to go towards where it should be in our community.
So to the point of that fight that you've been taking to City Hall repeatedly now, is that fight becoming any easier in the last couple of weeks, last couple of months, as we're seeing this upswell, this larger support for defunding the police? Are you at least getting any sort of movement there to better fund some of those programs?
I mean, I wish I can say that is getting easier, but clearly it's not, because we're not seeing a change. What we're seeing now is even more force and attention from the NYPD side to say, look at all of the increase in crime. This is why we need more police. And I even have colleagues in the city council who are within the same conference that I serve, who also believe that there should be more police in my district. And so the fight is on so many levels against so many people. And now we have a mayor that's saying that there's a potential layoff of 22,000 people come August 1st. So I think the fight is getting more serious. Is more serious at this point. And we need more people to continue to protest and demand change and defunding, but demanding more of where the funding should go. I think that's what's missing in the campaign, this hashtag defund NYPD. There's not enough conversation around where that money should actually go and demanding where it goes.
We're seeing, because of the coronavirus pandemic, a looming homeless crisis that reaches Great Depression era levels. We are seeing states and cities essentially have large deficits in their budgets. Do you worry that the squeeze economically that the virus is putting on cities might actually scuttle some of your attempts to divert funds to some of these programs that are so badly needed in the city?
What's really interesting is we see an increase in homelessness, right? But what I also see an increase in is hotels being opened at rapid rates, and hotels that are not being utilized for tourists. There are no tourists coming to New York City right now. What we're seeing is hotels opening in my district alone, just to be able to operate as a shelter. And they can do that because the city, puts more money into operating shelters than they do really looking for permanent homes and permanent housing for our homeless communities. And so again, that goes back to how we allocate funding across this city and what we put our priorities in. We prioritize more development and greedy developers wanting to make a profit from the city and people than we do actually protecting our everyday New Yorkers, including homeless.
All right, well, we will leave that there. Alika Ampry-Samuel, New York City Council member, thanks so much for joining us today to break down, again, the defund the police to the reallocation of resources from police. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And after the break, we're actually going to be talking Baidu as their revenue has shrunk under pressure from ByteDance. That's next. Welcome back to Yahoo Finance. Looking right now at Baidu, the tech company right now is down over 6.5% after they faced pressure from ByteDance, which forced their revenue to shrink. So for more on this, we're joined now by Yahoo Finance's Emily McCormick. Hey, Emily.
Hi, Kristen. So as you mentioned, taking a look at Baidu's results for the fiscal second quarter, that's China's top search engine, did see revenue shrink about 1% to 26 billion yuan, or about $3.7 billion, really driven here by an increase in competition. You mentioned ByteDance being a big component of that. If we also think about Tencent and some of those other companies within that are also competing just within the online advertising space and in China specifically. So if we take a look at Baidu's business overall, with any ad-driven business that we've seen, whether in the US, internationally, or in China, they have been facing pressure as well just because of the pandemic. The fact that other companies that serve as customers have been pulling back on their marketing spend in the face of the outbreak. So something to watch here as we look ahead for Baidu. If we think about some of the longer term investments as well, though, Baidu did mention in its earnings results that it's been investing more in artificial intelligence technology, its smart devices. It noted that revenue for these endeavors specifically grew by double-digit percentages in the second quarter, although it didn't break out those actual raw figures. So finally, last thing I want to point out from Baidu's results, did note the geopolitical aspect might not be as big of an overhang as it might be for some of these other companies listed in the US, but based in China. If we think about US senators trying to delist Chinese companies because of accounting concerns, one of the things that CFO Herman Yu said during yesterday's earnings call was that geopolitical tensions with the US, quote, doesn't have a meaningful impact due to Baidu's limited exposure outside China. So again, we do see shares of Baidu falling in intraday trading because of this miss on results, some light guidance, and as I know we're going to be talking about, some concerns over its investment with iQIYI.
So speaking of iQIYI, they are facing an SEC probe. Give us more details about that.
Well, iQIYI said yesterday in its earnings results that it was being investigated by the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. What the SEC is looking into is the production of certain financial and operating records dating from January 1st, 2018, as well as documents related to certain acquisitions and investments that were identified in a report issued by short seller firm Wolfpack Research in April 2020. Now, that research report had alleged that iQIYI inflated its 2019 revenue by as much as 13 billion yuan, or nearly $2 billion, for as much as a 44% overstatement versus actual results. Now, we do see shares of iQIYI actually falling about 15% in intraday trading, also dragging down Baidu as well, since that is the majority shareholder here of that company based in China. Kristen.
Thanks so much, Emily. Well, I want to turn now to Social Security, because a new poll from the AARP shows that more and more people are afraid for Social Security's future. So for more on this, we're joined now by Yahoo Finance's Sabeel Marcellus. Hey, Sabeel.
We're seeing that younger Americans, so those aged 30 to 49 in particular, are very concerned that Social Security will not be there for them when they retire. So their two top concerns are money running out of the funds and then the government not keeping its promises. So what we're seeing, according to this AARP survey, is that 72% don't think Social Security checks will be enough to get by on. On the flip side, other research has shown that younger working Americans do realize that, so they hope that they'll live longer, work longer, and find other sources of revenue by the time they retire, so they're not just relying on Social Security. But as of now, about 53% of Americans do expect for Social Security to be their primary source of income. That's what they're using right now. Now, Trump's executive order has worried a lot of people because the deferment of payroll taxes could impact the funding of Social Security. And on top of that, with the pandemic, we've seen many people lose their jobs, which means that even less is being funded in terms of money going into Social Security for the payroll tax. If people are not working, then they're not paying that payroll tax. So that's a significant concern for younger Americans, but they're hoping that they'll find other sources of revenue by the time they will have to retire.
Yes, Sabeel, and we've been talking about this a lot, as coronavirus, according to the Penn Wharton budget model, could wipe out Social Security 4 years sooner than expected. So more concerns there. Thanks so much, Sabeel. And one last look at the markets. The S&P 500 remains in the red right now. 3370 is the level. Of course, it had been touching record highs earlier in the week. NASDAQ remains in the red and the Dow is in the green. But for more live market coverage here on Yahoo Finance, stick with us. The final round is next.
Welcome to Yahoo Finance Live. This is the final round. I'm Akiko Fujita in for Miles Udlin on this Friday. And we are seeing all three major indices in the red right now, although the Dow's kind of been teetering back and forth here. The NASDAQ, the biggest laggard on the day, down about 0.3%. The S&P 500 failing to break above that record high we saw back in February, although it is hovering just slightly there. We are seeing that down about 3 points right now. Financials, energy, and industrials pushing higher today. The tech sector dipping in the red. We did see Apple down just over 0.5% after yesterday, coming close to that $2 trillion valuation at the close. Potentially some news out of Fortnite and that lawsuit maybe weighing on the stock. We're going to get to that a little later in the show. We did get some economic data out this morning pointing to a mixed picture on the recovery front. Let's start with retail sales. They did rise 1.2% in July. That was the third consecutive monthly gain, but it was below that 2.3% that was expected. A lot of question marks about how much of that momentum can be continued, especially with that enhanced unemployment benefit still yet to be extended with no stimulus deal over in Washington. We also got additional information on industrial production that's slowing to a gain of just 3% from 5.7% in June. A lot of news to get through to today, but let's start by kind of breaking down the action on this Friday. I want to turn to Shauna Smith, my co-anchor for the hour. Shauna, what stood out to you?
Hey there, Kiko. Well, it's interesting here. You mentioned the fact that we got some of that economic data out today. And I think overall, maybe if you would look at those headline numbers, you would think, wow, that's actually pretty disappointing. But once you dig into the numbers and also take into account what has happened, especially with coronavirus over the past month or two, I think that these numbers are better than they look like on the surface. So you mentioned that jump of only 1.2% in retail sales. It was below expectations, but I think it's important to highlight that we still are trending in the right direction. And I was going through a couple of notes out regarding the retail sales today. In Capital Economics, their note was pretty interesting, and it was titled basically that the recovery, it's losing pace, but it's not going into reverse. And that seems like that is enough for now, at least for investors. And then also that consumer sentiment number holding steady in the first half of August. And when you take into account the rising number of coronavirus cases across the country, the fact that the extra unemployment benefit of $600 a week ran out at the end of July, yet consumer spending and how they are feeling seems pretty good at this point. I think flat is okay. And then we're seeing that reflected in the broader markets today. I mean, we're slightly lower here, just falling below the flat line on all three of the major averages. But I think maybe some of the fear out there is that we would have had a bigger pullback. And the fact that we're not saying is investors saying that, hey, this data is fine, we are okay with it. And then speaking of that sector action that you were just talking about, we're seeing that rotation again today into some of those more cyclical sectors and out of what investors have been favoring over the past couple of weeks, or really over the past couple of months when it comes to tech. And the cyclical sectors continuing to perform well today. We have financials amongst the leaders, industrials, materials, all posting gains, all investors finding reasons to buy all three of those sectors. And then just drilling down into financials as we shift our focus from this week and on to next, I think the big question here for a lot of investors is whether or not we're going to see a bigger appetite here amongst investors to buy some of these banks, to buy some of these financial names. Because when you take a look at this week, yeah, financials did well, but when we see the big boost that we got in terms of what the treasuries did, you would think that, hey, financials should have done a little bit better. So I think this brings up the question about whether or not we can truly have a bull market without the participation of some financials. And when you take into account that banks are well below their 52-week high, off over 20% from their highest levels that they've hit over the past year, I think that will be a focus for investors ahead, not only next week really, but for the next several weeks as we look to justify this bull market that we're in right now.
Yeah, Shauna, going back to that point you made there, we're kind of at where we should be looking at this is stalled growth better than going backwards? That's kind of the reality of where we are right now. And Jared, I want to turn to you on the action today. Shauna's been talking, we've been talking all week actually about this move we've seen away from tech. I feel like on a weekly basis, we talk about this rotation out of tech. Whether that sticks or not is a whole nother question, but I'm curious how you break down the moves that we saw in the market today.
Yeah, we see rotation not only on a daily basis, but intraday as well. For instance, today started out with tech and communication services and discretionary. In other words, the three FANG-ish sectors with the most exposure leading. And then that changed throughout the day. And this is what you see in market rallies. We see changing leadership. You don't have to have the same names going up every day. And when you have that changing leadership, it also diminishes volatility. And so if we take a look at the VIX here, just give me a second while I bring it up, we can see that's been hovering just around, just above about 20 here. And we have this long-term trend line still intact here. And it's really not a threat when you see this rotation until you see a big spike up in the VIX. And that usually signals that some sectors are more willing than others to roll over. And in the case of the FANGs, if that's happening, probably going to take down the whole market. But on a day-to-day basis, as long as the FANGs aren't going down that much and maybe just up a little, it's perfectly normal to have other sectors, especially the cyclical and value ones, expand. You're not going to see it at this stage in the business cycle every single day, but typically, and the last expansion that we had was 10 years, that was kind of an exception. Usually values and cyclicals play a bigger role when you get that expansion. So we saw that a little bit in 2009 into the early part of 2010, but didn't really last that much. And it was kind of on and off again then. You look at the prior rally expansion from the after the NASDAQ bubble burst, we saw value and cyclicals lead for years. And so maybe we're in store for that again, but not really happening right now.
Jared, one of the stocks that we saw a move higher today, Simon Property Group, up about 3% right now on that news that it, along with Authentic Brands, is now acquiring Lucky out of bankruptcy. And Dan, this is the second acquisition we're talking about from Simon this week. Brooks Brothers, another one we talked about. What should we make of a mall owner trying to save its tenants, essentially, which is what we're seeing happen?
Right. I thought all the malls were dead. And Simon stock, we should mention, up 3% on the news. By the way, a little bit of personal relevance for me here because I worked at Lucky Brand Jeans for a couple summers over in Chestnut Hill in Newton, Mass. It's interesting. I mean, it's sort of like many things we discussed. The death of X has been greatly exaggerated, right? I mean, Simon has been very much under fire. The pandemic certainly has not helped. But some of these names, they're able to kind of buy the bones up, if you will, for pretty cheap. I mean, this deal is $140 million. ABG, by the way, quietly the owner of media brands like Sports Illustrated, but also Nine West and a couple other fashion names, Barney's, which it bought up. And in many of these deals, it really is sort of the remaining bones. So I imagine you're going to see some of the storefronts saved and kept open. Not all, but a lot of these chains also overbuilt back when things were good. Lucky, of course, had filed for bankruptcy, I believe, back in July, or at least bankruptcy protection. But it's interesting. I mean, malls are not going to go away entirely. I mean, right here where I live in Connecticut, they just recently, pre-pandemic though, built a brand new luxury mall that just opened. So, you have to wonder what's going to happen with that. But there are going to be less of them. I think they overbuilt. They're going to close a lot of full malls. They're going to close a lot of stores. But if they can get on the cheap some of these retail names that I think still have power in their brand name, then that's pretty good. And that's been the ABG playbook, as they buy up things that they think, well, even though X business isn't doing so well, we think there's a lot of value to be wrung out of the brand name. That's the Sports Illustrated thinking, at least.
It's also interesting to pair this news and this announcement with the ongoing kind of discussions that Amazon is reportedly having with Simon to potentially refurbish JCPenney's for warehouses. But I think there are a lot of glitches actually in play. It's a lot more complex than just saying, okay, Amazon now has access to all of these properties. They would have to be rezoning. A distribution or warehouse is very different from a retailer. There would be co-tenancy issues because if there are other tenants in the mall itself, that could pose a lot of problems. And then kind of zooming out a bit, I think the comments from David Simon, the CEO of Simon Properties on Monday during their earnings call, what really stood out to me was they're looking for more sort of distressed retailers to jump in on. And that could potentially include, okay, let's buy up this property or this store space and then make a supermarket or a grocery store. And I think a lot of Americans are confused by that sort of strategy because we know grocery is a low margin business to begin with. But if you think about Latin America, if you think about Asia, that's just a kind of brilliant execution, right? Akiko, I know you were based in Asia for years. I had frequented Korea many years. The best part of a mall, in my mind, in Asia is the supermarket basement, first floor level. So I think if the US strategy can sort of embrace that potential, okay, if you go to a mall, it's not pure consumption, it's not pure frivolity where you're buying discretionary goods and you can actually go grocery shopping, I think there could be a huge advantage there. And maybe Simon is forcing itself in a way to be creative during this time.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at the mall experience and how it's going to evolve. And I should point out, I used to call the basement of those malls my happy place because of all the food there. But for those who haven't been, I guess it's hard to try to explain exactly. So let's talk about the other retail news that we got today. Rent the Runway announcing that they're going to be closing all of their physical stores. The service, of course, the rental business still intact, but what does this mean for their business?
Yeah, Akiko, the writing was on the wall because in March, Rent the Runway did lay off all of its retail employees. For more context here, there are 5 store locations across the country, including New York, DC, San Francisco, LA, and Chicago as kind of the expected cities you would anticipate. We do have a statement from the president and CEO of Rent the Runway, Anushka Salinas, and she says in part, the closure of our stores is something we had long considered as part of the evolution of our overall business strategy, as the primary use case of our stores has been pick up and drop off, and was a decision we accelerated during the pandemic. We continue to innovate, et cetera, et cetera. I want to share, I've spoken with a few sources here on Rent the Runway. They say that about 50% of customers are actually outside some of those major cities I just mentioned. It tends to overlap with the Stitch Fix customer, people who do live in suburbs, people who do live in remote areas, who perhaps don't have access to some of those bougier brands that Rent the Runway does carry. And then apparently 80% of the US, they are in the shipping code areas for Rent the Runway services. So that still means 20% of the country has not yet had access to Rent the Runway clothing. So from RTR's point of view, they're saying we would rather penetrate fully. We would rather be able to access the entire American populace, if you will, rather than just depending on this foot traffic from city dwellers. And then the last point here is they had expanded into categories like children's clothing. That for now seems to be put on hold, and they have zero plans to enter the men's business, as we have seen, as we mentioned earlier, the Brooks Brothers of the world, the men's warehouses of the world, kind of, suffering and struggling quite immensely during this time.
And guys, just to further the point here on Rent the Runway, there is a thread that Melody and Miles Udlin and I and Shauna, especially in the last few weeks, have loved exploring, and that is how the pandemic has really pushed back against the tide of online-only DTC brands that started out at first being DTC retail, saying we don't need a physical footprint. But then, ironically, once they got a footprint and once they had some success online, they started opening up storefronts. And it turned out, maybe it's not true that brick and mortar is totally dead, because even these online-only brands want brick and mortar. But then the pandemic hit. And so now you see that, well, because of recent circumstances, the transition into omni-channel, as the buzzword goes, has not been so easy and has kind of been halted. I mean, Rent the Runway in its statement, trying to kind of brush off how negative this news looks by saying, as Melody mentioned, well, more customers were using our drop boxes anyway. We're just going to have the boxes, and not as many people were using the retail stores. Well, okay, but what this really is maybe a reversal of that trend that we were seeing. And maybe some of those DTC brands, especially after the pandemic, even when things return to normal, so to speak, maybe some of them are going to peel back a little or slow down those plans to start opening physical storefronts. A couple of them, they had their showrooms to try to get customers in the door and then move them to online. Your Bonoboses, your Warby Parkers, and your Rent the Runways.
Yeah, I mean, certainly makes sense given that not a lot of people are still comfortable going out into stores. And I guess the point being that if you are a company that started direct to consumer, you've definitely got a stronger foundation in that space, and you're able to pull away even without the physical stores in place. Let's move on to some headlines on the coronavirus front today, because we did get developing news on the race to develop that coronavirus vaccine. The UK government announcing today it has secured key deals with Johnson & Johnson and Novavax, while we heard from the European Commission talking about their own deal with AstraZeneca. Angelique Kamlani is tracking all the deal making for us today. Walk us through the specifics.
Thanks, Akiko. Yeah, so while a lot of the financial disclosures haven't been made available, we do know that the European Union did strike a deal with AstraZeneca for 400 million doses and is in talks with Johnson & Johnson for 200 million doses. Meanwhile, the UK did in fact make a deal with Johnson & Johnson for 30 million and Novavax for 60 million doses, as well as collaborations on their phase 3 trials, which are going to be global trials. And as we know, that's the last stage and really important for determining whether or not these vaccines are in fact going to be effective. Meanwhile, we also have the U.S. Health Department out with an announcement that McKesson is going to be in charge of distributing the vaccines for Operation Warp Speed. And McKesson is one of those companies that did, in fact, was charged with distribution of the H1N1 vaccine back in the 2009 flu pandemic. All of this to say that, we're still sort of in a wait and see period when it comes to which vaccines are effective. Meanwhile, cases, continue to rise across the country, and continues to be a concern that the U.S. remains a major hotspot for this virus outbreak. Dr. Anthony Fauci, the nation's top epidemiologist, yesterday saying, very disappointed, quote unquote, not pleased with where we are today with the outbreak. Akiko?
And Angelique, to that point, we did reach a grim milestone here in California today, the state becoming the first in the country to surpass that 600,000 mark in terms of cases. Now, Anthony Fauci is saying he's certainly not pleased with where things are, but in some of the hotspot states, we have seen the transmission, that the rate of that start to slow, and yet we're seeing the positivity rates go up.
Right. Well, and there's also confusion about, the testing, whether or not the testing has slowed down and whether or not that is in fact a result of all this. But definitely some questions into positivity rates. And Dr. Fauci talking about how that is in fact, a concerning trend and could lead to more cases soon.
Yeah. A lot to get through to, Angelique. Go get some water there. Thanks so much for bringing us those headlines. We are off for a quick break, but coming up, we're going to be diving into our call of the day. And yes, it is on Tesla, a big call coming from Morgan Stanley and Bank of America. We'll have that for you on the other side of the break. Shares of Tesla up about 0.8%, with just under an hour left to go in the trading day today. This after getting an upgrade from Morgan Stanley. Analyst Adam Jonas upgrading the stock from underweight to equal weight, also raising the price target to $13.60 a share from $10.50, although that is still below the $16.32 mark we're seeing the stock trading at today. All of this, according to Morgan Stanley, on the potential of the company's battery technology and Tesla's potential ability to own the entire EV stock. Shauna, Morgan Stanley just downgraded the stock last month, but we're now looking to the September 22nd battery day. And there seems to be a lot riding on that, at least in this call, about where Tesla can go beyond just their cars.
Yeah, Kiko, I think you're exactly right. And it's interesting that Adam Jonas kind of had this reversal of his call so quickly, but it's still not that bullish of a call. I mean, he has a hold rating on the stock. Its price target right now is about 20% below where it's currently trading. So I think he's still a little bit questionable about Tesla's valuation. But you're exactly right when you're talking about the battery business and that coming into play here. And I think that basically almost changed the thesis on the stock. We had the battery day coming up next month. It'll be in the middle of September. So we're going to get a little bit more information on that. And it reminds me of the conversation that we both had earlier this week when we talked to, he's the Tesla bull, but he's also a shareholder, Gally Russell. And he was just talking about the importance of the battery business. And when I was asking him about it, I felt like he almost jumped out of his seat before I was even done my question. But that just really highlights, I think, the importance and the excitement that's so many people who are close watchers of Tesla have about the company's battery business and the future of that and what that means for its valuation. So I think maybe a big reason why Tesla is valued at where it is today has a little bit more than we initially thought, at least than I initially thought, that it has to do with its battery business. And I wonder if that's one of the reasons. I think it is that the stock has climbed so much, so quickly over the past several months. And then real quick, just one more important thing. I mean, Tesla, it seems like it can almost do no wrong. The market cap of this company, $289 billion. And this is a company that has had a couple of worrisome headlines over the past several months, yet investors able to shrug that off, and people who love Tesla are still seeing reason to buy the stock at over $1,600 a share.
And guys, it's interesting about the Morgan note here. It says that the stock is going to move based on two factors, neither of which is the business of selling cars. So as Shauna mentioned, batteries and a lot of excitement around batteries, maybe justified, maybe not, but then also software and services. Surprise, it sounds a lot like the story on Apple for a year. While Apple was busy saying, iPhone sales declining, sending out warnings at the beginning of, 2019, iPhone sales in China alert, all the analysts who were so bullish pivoted to saying, well, over here, there's the software and services. And so we're still very bullish. Now I feel like we got to start preparing to hear the services argument in support of Tesla. Now, I also want to say, in some ways, the stock has moved a lot already for factors not related to selling cars. I mean, even in some quarters when, Tesla in the past has been dinged for missing shipments, people say, well, the stock's up anyway because everyone believes so much in Elon Musk. Of course, more recently, there has been a lot of success in meeting those shipments and being profitable in some quarters. But it is always a stock that has moved not based just on fundamentals, right? Not based on just financials. It's because of the story and the narrative. And in the other note we're talking about today, the B of A note, there was a little line that along those lines stuck out to me, and it said that the stock is going to move thanks to its continued growth story more than anything else. I just wrote today about Airbnb wanting to go public, and that's another example where the company's sales were down 70% last quarter, but it's going public anyway. Why? Because it's going to tell its story. It's going to convince the market with its narrative of, we'll be back, our business is strong, this is just a temporary roadblock. And the markets right now are very willing to just buy into a narrative about future runway.
And Dan, touching upon that parallel you drew with Apple, I think another sort of facet there is when Apple announced that they're switching from Intel processors and Macs to their own. I think that's the same exact story you're seeing from this battery pack, right? To think that EVs, their biggest competitor is Tesla, but their best bet when it comes to finding the best battery for their vehicles would be Tesla. That is a really, really difficult position for any of these competitors, whether it's the Benzes, whether it's the Audis, Nikola, for them to really be in this space. And I think it's particularly fascinating because we have seen, whether it's the Rivians of the world, really trying to gear up, right? It's the Chinese Tesla, It's all of these upstarts that are trying to make headway here in addition to the incumbent players. And I do feel as though the more they proliferate the space, the clearer the chasm is, the clearer it is that Tesla really is synonymous with electric vehicles, at least for the average consumer and for people who are trying to think about what their next car purchase will be right now. I think touching upon that bearish component of the B of A note, they call it uninspiring that after 17 years in existence, Tesla is only now making about 500,000 cars a year and reaching just above or break even profit and free cash flow, kind of summarizing, Shauna and Dan, your points of, the threshold was so low because we had such low expectation when it came to deliverables, when it came to actual eking out of profit, that now I think analysts themselves are very confounded by just how much this stock has run based on pure exuberance alone.
Yeah, and Melody, going back to Dan's point, the question really is going to be, come battery day, is it really just about the narrative, or is the company actually production ready? And I thought it was interesting in this note, Adam Jonas says, based on the body of evidence collected and research, that they look at the third-party battery and the EV powertrain supply business for Tesla. You break that out, the base case for them is that alone is worth $310 a share. So we'll be watching the announcement coming out on that next month. All right, off for another break, but coming up, the Department of Labor with new rules on ESG investing. Voya Investment Investment Management CEO Christine Hertzellers will join us on what this means for your retirement plans after the break. A new proposal out from the Department of Labor looks to impose stricter limits on ESG investment in retirement plans. To discuss the implications of this, we're joined by Christine Hertzellers. She's the CEO of Voya Investment Management. Christine, it's great to have you on tonight. Let's talk about the ruling that came out earlier this month. Walk us through what the changes are in this proposal.
Well, the Department of Labor put out a proposal, or essentially responded to the concept of ESG investing, because as you know, it's becoming more and more popular and profound here in the United States. And essentially, the Department of Labor was saying, as a fiduciary, they're really putting a higher bar or level of standards on somebody that's designing a plan for their employees if they want to include ESG investments. And so just to single out ESG investments specifically in that way, we do not think is a good thing and in the best interest of plan participants.
What specifically does that mean, though, for retirement plans? It's not saying you can't necessarily invest in it, but what exactly is ESG defined as in this plan? And what are the implications for an actual investment?
Well, ESG can take many different flavors, if you will. So again, ESG, environmental, social, government. Those are the factors that you think about. And there are all kinds of things you can do with an ESG investment. What you would call more exclusionary, meaning I don't want energy or carbon emissions, or you can just have a ESG aware investment process behind the product. So it's a very broad continuum of what a plan participant can choose from, or what the fiduciary who's overseeing that for them can include. And so again, when you think about ESG investments as well, they've performed very well. They've been in Europe for literally tens of years, right? We have over 10 years of data on how these assets or these investments have performed when you think about ESG. And Morningstar recently has shown some strong statistics that ESG funds have outperformed their index or non-ESG counterparts.
So we're still talking about a proposal here. What specifically are you calling on the Department of Labor to do? Because to your point, you've also looked at where investors stand on this in terms of being able to get that return on ESG investing in their retirement plans. It's certainly a popular move. So what exactly are you asking the Department of Labor to do?
Well, essentially not single out ESG investing as a higher bar for qualitative judgment that the plan design or the employer has to consider. Because there's always judgment as far as how you design the plan, what target dates you apply as an example of the investment lineup. So judgment is required for any employer that's designing this. So to single out ESG as sort of a higher bar that you have to prove, that it's definitely better than the index counterpart doesn't seem like the right answer. Number one, it's proving itself to be that way. And then number two, when we've surveyed our clients, 67% of our clients, and again, Voya is one of the largest retirement administrators in the country, 76 want their employer to consider ESG. And we also found 68% of those people said, 60% rather said, I am more likely to save if you have these offerings in my plan. And why that's so important is, listen, we are in a world of what we call negative interest rates, right? What that means is that, rates are lower than inflation, and that really penalizes savers. That means now people are going to have to save more than ever just to stay even and get to the retirement goals. And so again, putting things in place where clearly we see a lot of alignment with employee values, it just isn't logical to us.
Christine, just to push back a little bit, I think kind of as you alluded to, ESG has gotten a lot of hype, a lot of buzz, but also a lot of scrutiny, where there are some firms that have been created specifically, explicitly to focus on that line of investing, and the returns are not necessarily guaranteed, right? The returns are not necessarily going to be higher. When you think about this added layer of scrutiny, could that possibly be a positive that will be a bit more critical and will be able to define ESG in a more comprehensive, robust way?
Yeah, I would say, that the issue you're bringing out is more of what we would call greenwashing, or people putting products in place and saying that either their investment process considers ESG as an example, but not really following through with that. And so again, going back to the judgment aspect of the fiduciary or a person overseeing the plan, it's very important to actually look at the factors. Look at, is that investment manager truly using, a rigorous, robust process to consider it? And again, the data shows, as Morningstar, has indicated, MSCI, there are different places that have shown that if you have a quality ESG fund, it does outperform the broader market. And it's not episodic. It's not simply in COVID because energy underperformed. Truly, what it's trying to get at is thinking very hard about, are you doing the right thing? Are you a good employer? And are you taking care of, your environment It's not just that, it's also, are you well governed? Do you have good risk controls in place? So all these things make a lot of sense for good strategic investments, and that is under the label of ESG.
Christine Hertzeller, Voya Investment Management CEO, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you very much.
Coming up, an epic battle between the Fortnite creator and Apple and Google, why Epic Games is taking the tech giants to court. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the final round. Just under 30 minutes left to go in the trading week, and we are seeing all three major indices in the red. The losses accelerating in this session. Let's bring in Jared Blickery for a breakdown of the action. Jared.
Well, let's take a look at the S&P 500, what it's done this week first. The Wi-Fi Interactive. And see, today we are down by session lows here. If we look at the 5-day price action for this week, we can still see that we're pretty close to the highs here. The only big movement we had was that big drop off on Wednesday. And looking over the last 13 days, the beginning of this leg here, you can see we've really just been flagging near highs, and that sets up a very good opportunity to go higher next week, which it looks like we're going to have to wait for to get that all-time high in the S&P 500 if it happens. Possible it doesn't. Also want to take a look at some other markets here, specifically gold. Now, gold has had a very volatile week. And let's just reduce this to a 5-day. And we can see that some of the price movement, not only gold, but also silver, really shook out a lot of people, but it's been pretty steady over the last few days. That leads me into our Yahoo Finance Premium Investment idea of the day, which is Newmont Corporation, of course, that big gold miner. And we can see over the year, they have had a decent run, up 46%. And Argus Research likes them. They're reiterating their $72 price target that would be up here by their record highs only recently. And they're saying the shares have outperformed over the past year, rising 67% compared to a 17% gain for the S&P 500. And from a technical standpoint, the shares have been in a bullish pattern of higher highs and higher lows since May 2019. The company recently raised its quarterly dividend by 79% to a quarter, or $1 annually, for a yield of about 1.6%. Again, their price target is 72. That would be a 12% appreciation from the current levels. Akiko?
All right. Thanks so much for that, Jared. Well, Fortnite is, or we should say Fortnite developer Epic Games is taking the fight to Apple and Google, suing the tech giants after both removed the game from their app stores. Alexis Keenan is tracking the story for us. Alexis, Apple and Google have made it pretty clear that this was a direct violation of the rules in the App Store, and Epic Games isn't necessarily disputing that. But what specifically are they asking for in this lawsuit?
Okay, so this is a lawsuit and it's really based on antitrust claims. And what they want is an injunction. So Epic here, Fortnite, not asking for compensatory damages, not saying, hey, we've lost a lot of money and we want it back. They're saying we want back in the Google and App stores. So what they did is they actually Epic did a way for players to make direct in-game purchases. That's the big no-no there. And that is those are fees that are charged while players are playing their games. And it's 30% in the Apple Store, it's 30% with Google, but Epic is saying, no, it shouldn't be that high. And that is really an illegal monopoly that these companies are running. So whether these claims, though, are really a slam dunk, not necessarily. Epic has a lot to prove here. For example, they'll have to show that these fees that are called restraints in antitrust law, they'll have to show that they're harming consumers and not just harming Epic by itself. Also, they're going to have to show that there's a competition harm there and that they're not just getting hit on their own revenues. Now, it's interesting to point out that Epic does own its own app store that it's created, and it charges its developers a 12% fee. So that starts to make the argument look like, well, what's the right amount then? Is it 30% at Apple and Google? Is it 12% at, which Epic is charging for its developers? Or is it something else like a 5%? So the courts are going to have a lot to think about here. And of course, these are subjects that are heavily being investigated, not only within the United States, but also by the European Commission. So this is actually a really good timed lawsuit, I would say, because there is so much public sentiment around perhaps regulating these companies.
Alexis, Dan here. Just to play off what you just said, there's a big difference, obviously, between the sentiment around the Apple App Store, which of course has been negative for a while now. We had the executive from that email app, Hey, H-E-Y, on the show a couple weeks ago, and they were saying the same thing. It's a monopoly, it's not fair, but there's a difference between the sentiment and the optics and the legal element, right? And the other sort of tickle here is that Epic Games, more than other companies, especially more than Hey, the example I just mentioned, can stand to be off the App Store for a while and can kind of take the hit, and they have the cash to be able to withstand that. The problem is it's become the cost of doing business because so many other new apps, well, they got to be on the App Store. If they want to catch a foothold, they got to be listed in the App Store. So they have to do the 30% fees. So all that said, I'm just curious whether you think that there's really any possibility here that whether it's this lawsuit prompting it or something else, that lawmakers go after the App Store, that Apple actually has to change these draconian fees it charges.
Well, Apple has good arguments on its side too, right? It's going to say, we invested in the infrastructure to build this platform, that we were it doesn't necessarily mean that you're the first player to this market, that you therefore get to control it forever and ever. But they're going to say, we provide a market for these developers. We provide them with tools for app development. So they do have, arguments, good arguments on their side. But I will say the attorneys that were hired for this litigation on behalf of Epic, these are seasoned antitrust litigators. They know what they're doing. And certainly this lawsuit was timed out. They had it ready to go as soon as they announced that they were going to make this direct purchase available and sidestep the app stores. But one other thing to really note, I think here is, and I expect Apple and Google to raise this, is that 40% of Epic is owned by the Chinese behemoth Tencent, which also owns WeChat, which is also in the crosshairs with the U.S. government in terms of the executive orders that President Trump has recently signed. Very, very still a lot of questions around how those will be interpreted. But I expect that type of argument would be made too.
Alexis, let's talk about another legal case you have been following. This is Uber and Lyft. A Superior Court judge denying the company's attempt to delay that preliminary injunction from going into effect, essentially saying that companies have to classify their employees as full-time by August 20th. So what other legal avenues, are there for Lyft and Uber, or at this point, are they going to have to either classify or, as they have threatened, essentially halt the business in order to be in compliance?
Yeah, so both companies have said that they will appeal. Now, they were given 10 days to appeal, and that deadline happens on August 20th. They went into court and they said, look, we need more time than that to get our appeal together. Probably should have had their ducks in a row to not run into that problem. But they, like you've said, have threatened to leave the state or at least temporarily suspend service there. Now, when they do file their appeal and it goes up to the appellate court, that judge might say, we're going to issue a stay. We're not going to make you classify your drivers as employees right now. They could also say, no, you do have to classify your employees as drivers right now. So if they do, of course, tons of expenses that come with that. You have payroll taxes, you have benefits for these employees, you have paid leave, you have insurance, all kinds of, and also you have to pay the drivers for the use of their cars potentially. All big expenses, and the companies know that, and they don't sound like they have aligned that in their business model yet. That's one of the arguments that they made in court, trying to get this extra time, saying we have to restructure our entire business models in order to do this. But they just released one of their economists from